Thank you, Clive, for presenting us. I agree with you that the paper is perhaps a bit more ambitious than it should. I will try to make the presentation a bit more modest, as I will focus just on a couple of ideas from the paper. And the paper deals with the Cambridge Social Ontology project and how that project can contribute to give us a different angle to the idea of a reconstruction of economic theory, as the idea was outlined by Joan Robinson at some point. So I will start perhaps by explaining a little bit of the Cambridge Social Ontology project. Some parts of it, I will not go into it because they will be covered in the subsequent presentations by Yannick and Toru. But I will focus on the parts which are relevant for the topic I want to address later, which is the reconstruction of economic theory. So the Cambridge Social Ontology project, even before this term, Cambridge Social Ontology, emerged, started to be more well known through two books, which were Economics and Reality and Reorienting Economics by Tony Lawson. And at the time, the key idea was a critique of mainstream economics understood as an uncritical adherence to mathematical deductivist methods. So the key idea at the time was that this mainstream economics is committed to a wrong conception of science because it attributes to the methods the essence of the scientific endeavor, when in fact science is about uncovering the structures which are causing the events we observe, not necessarily characterized in terms of the methods. That is, mathematical deductivist methods may have been useful in some contexts where we have closed systems, such as case of natural science where you can create closed systems artificially in a laboratory context, or cases such as astronomy where you can where you have these irregularities. But in the social world, perhaps you don't need such as an ambitious commitment to very sophisticated mathematical methods. All you need sometimes is just some descriptive statistics, and an analysis of social structures does not benefit from over elaboration on those methods. So that was the first stage. And the second stage, where I'm dividing in two stages in the paper, we can perhaps identify even more. But the second stage was then moving on to a study of the structure of social reality. So if this conception of science, of mainstream economics, is incorrect, then what we should do as an alternative. And the subsequent idea was to try to look at how the structure of social reality is constituted. And social positioning theory emerged at this stage as a way to characterize social reality through processes of social positioning. So human beings are allocated to social positions characterized by packages of rights and obligations and are connected through these rights and obligations. And this is how the basic structure of social reality is constituted. And the basis for understanding social positioning is human practices. This is something that Yannick is going to talk in more detail in this presentation when he talks about rights and obligations and their connection to human practices. But human practices, the way I am taking them in the paper, are the starting point for the analysis of social reality. So this can be seen in contrast, for example, to the case of mainstream economics, where you have utility function, or you have some sort of characterization of the human agents. And then if you want to bring norms or normativity at all, you bring them in as an outcome of this interaction between maximizing agents. So typically in game theoretical frameworks, for example, norms emerge out of this interaction. Here, the way I'm taking it, normativity is not something that you derive out of something else. It's at the very basis, it's the very way through which social reality is constituted. And various categories which are relevant for understanding capitalism and the economy in general have been devised through this project. Perhaps the more prominent categories which have been elaborated are money, so on the studies on the nature of money, technology, gender, and corporations. So what I try to do in the paper is try to weave together previous analysis undertaken by others, of course, of these categories, and try to see how they can help us reach a theory of capitalism understood as a process of accumulation of capital, drawing on the notions of money and technology to characterize capital, and on ideas on how the corporation emerges, also to understand how the corporation contributes to the process of accumulation of capital. This is one of the things I do in the paper. The other thing I do in the paper, which is the one that perhaps I'm going to go into more detail in here in the time I have allocated, is also to explain how this project can help in providing a different angle to the project of the reconstruction of economic theory. So perhaps I will go now into that parts, and then I can also address the connections to capitalism if I have time, but I will focus now on the reconstruction of economic theory. Now, the reconstruction of economic theory, as undertaken by John Robinson, emerged after the so-called Cambridge controversies in the theory of capital. So this debate between economists located in Cambridge, UK, Cambridge, Massachusetts, hence the name the Cambridge controversies. And at this time, the main critique was a critique of the production function when it started. It started with John Robinson, at least in the public arena, as a critique of the production function and the use of the production function to define marginal productivity. So the marginal productivity of labor, the marginal productivity of capital, and this would give us a technical characterization of distribution. So you could determine distribution of income technically in mathematical terms using the production function in mainstream economics. It goes back to John Bates Clark, and Veblen had already criticized this attempt. And when John Robinson made the critique, several contributors appeared, and the work of Piero Sraffa, of course, was very relevant. He was already exchanging letters with John Robinson on this even before our paper was published. And Sraffa had this approach, and the approach was that when you want to criticize someone, you should start from shared premises. So Sraffa thought that the best way to criticize mainstream economics was to start from this kind of technical analysis that mainstream economists were engaging in. So try to use the mathematical language and then try to find inconsistencies, mathematical inconsistencies, such as the one he found in the process of reswitching, so that he could show that the theoretical framework of mainstream economics was flawed. And that's the route that was followed. But John Robinson increasingly felt that things like reswitching and these technical aspects were far less important than the more substantial methodological critique that was implied. In fact, at some point, John Robinson even said that Veblen had made the same point when criticizing John Bates Clark, Irving Fisher. Veblen had made the point more clearly than John Robinson herself done. And it's, of course, a mystery why John Robinson ever said that. But I think a plausible explanation is that Veblen, by focusing on aspects connected to human practice, conventions, institutions, and so on, was going more directly to the methodological points rather than the subsequent contributors who were focusing increasingly on technical aspects. So, of course, then when you have in mainstream economics the determination of the distribution through the marginal productivity of capital, what you have done is that you have removed normativity from mainstream economics. And one of the consequences of the critique of capital theory at the time was that distribution was at best seen as an exogenous aspect from the point of view of economic theory. So you don't have a marginal productivity theory which can consistently determine distribution. Rather, distribution is set by exogenous forces, and those exogenous forces were typically seen as political aspects, social aspects. So there was a way to bring in normativity again into economic theory. And John Robinson at some point thought that Sraffa's theory could be a basis for a reconstruction of economic theory along different lines. And this, so far what I've done is that I've characterized the Cambridge Social Ontology project, and I've broadly outlined the key issues I want to address regarding the Cambridge controversies. And what I want to explain now, what I want to say now is that the reason why this reconstruction of economic theory didn't have as much impact as it could have had is essentially because the debate stayed too much on these technical aspects. And if you accept that mainstream economics is characterized by an uncritical commitment to mathematical deductivist methods, if you accept that's an adequate characterization of mainstream economics, as I think it is, but of course we can discuss that, then it's very unlikely that if you are focusing only on technical aspects, you will get a radical change of how economics is thought and researched, because you are never questioning the essence of the method. Now, you can use the method for finding lots of inconsistencies in mainstream economics, but the solution will be another mathematical method, as it was the case, for example, with neo-Walrasian general equilibrium theory that was subsequently used as a replacement to the production function and the other concepts that were found to be insufficient. So, of course, you can also find inconsistencies in general equilibrium theory, as were found subsequently by Garignani and other contributors to the debate. But although it seems very plausible to start from Sraffa's starting point, that you must start from shared premises and find inconsistencies, if it is also the case that mainstream economics is characterized by this uncritical commitment to mathematical deductivist methods, it is also the case that you must do the subsequent step at some point and question the essence of those very methods. And I believe that that is the reason why Joan Robinson at some point felt that the methodological critique was more important than the technical critique. That is the reason why she found that Veblen had made the point in a clearer way. Veblen had gone straight to the key questions, as opposed to focusing just on technical aspects. And so I think that once you understand the essence of mainstream economics in the way it is understood in the Cambridge Social Ontology project, you can also make sense of the reason why the debate didn't quite ignite the change, the revolution in economic theory, the reconstruction of economic theory, or the revival of political economy. These are all expressions that were used at various times for this idea. Why it didn't ever happen? Now, once you want, but I want to say even something more than that. I want to say that you can draw on Cambridge Social Ontology to interpret why the result of the debate was this, but you can also find an angle for what could be this project of a reconstruction of economic theory. And there are some elements of this already in Sraffa, especially in the research on the connections between Sraffa and Wittgenstein. I am very afraid of attempts to explain these connections between Sraffa and Wittgenstein, as sometimes it is done as if Sraffa was teaching Wittgenstein a new way of thinking, because of course we know Wittgenstein was an extremely intelligent person. And as John Davies once told me, you cannot make sense of these debates by just thinking that it was a one-way route of Sraffa teaching Wittgenstein. There was here an interaction. And while Sraffa wanted to focus on human practices as they are exteriorized exhibits, and you can observe them, because Sraffa wanted to focus on things which are observable, Wittgenstein was looking at what kind of meaning you could find through these human practices. But with them, human practices were the basis for any project of understanding human activity. It's like once you go to practices, you have reached the limit of what you can explain, because everything else is explained through those practices too. So you will end up reaching a circular kind of reasoning if you want to go further back than the practices and explain them, as it is often attempted when you have game theoretical frameworks to explain norms and so on. And human practices are also at the basis of the Cambridge Social Ontology project. So in the paper, I try to explore these connections. I don't have time to go into that specific exploration or the ways in which the notions evolved in the debate between Sraffa and Wittgenstein, the way in which it was also implied in Keynes' approach to conventions, even though Keynes adopted a different language when talking about these things. So these are things I address in the paper. Here, what I want to focus on essentially is what kind of method emerges then for this reconstruction of economic theory. And the main method is one that Sraffa once characterized as looking at the conditions of reproduction of the economy and society at a given moment in time. So in this project, in Sraffa's theory, which is the one that John Robinson is drawing on, of course, bringing in elements from Keynes, from Kalecki, from other authors, but it seems that the Straussian scheme is always at the basis of the project. Reality is deeply interconnected. So, and it's because reality is deeply interconnected that you cannot really isolate separated parts and understand them and try to understand them in isolation. That's, by the way, why mathematical deductivist methods, when they presuppose isolation, end up delivering an insufficient account of social reality. And Strauss was discussing the method of Marshall, because Marshall is also aware of this interdependent nature of social reality. But what Marshall does is essentially say, well, let's assume ceteris paribus for a time that that this is stopped, that other aspect is stopped, and then tries to look at demand and supply, for example, as independent forces, and now you reach an equilibrium between these independent things. But if things are deeply interconnected, by the moment you are looking at them as independent things from which you want to reach an equilibrium, when you do that, you have already destroyed, so to speak, you have already brought something which is completely inconsistent with the nature of the reality you are analyzing. So that's why Strauss wanted to look at the conditions of reproduction of a whole, of an interconnected totality at a given moment in time. But he never elaborated quite much on this because he was essentially, well, in his book, the book is subtitled Prelude to a Critique of Economic Theory. So the book was designed to be a critique of economic theory, an internal critique starting from some shared premises, not all, but some were. So you could never look at the notion of reproduction at least in the published writings, as a basis for this reconstruction of economic theory. But I do think that once we look to the economy and the society as an interconnected totality, once you do that and you start, then you must start from the conditions of reproduction, economic and social reproduction at a given moment in time. That is a more adequate basis for any project of a reconstruction of economic theory. And the notion which is here implied concerning human agency is also something I can perhaps elaborate a little bit upon, because it also helps addressing other critiques that were made to this project. By the way, of course, when I'm talking about the reproduction of social activity, what I'm suggesting is that you can look at these results in social ontology as a basis for studying the reproduction of social reality as a totality, because I've argued in other papers that this underlying vision of the economy is, which you can associate with projects in Cambridge social ontology, is also similar to the one we have in Strauss when he is considering the economy as an interconnected totality. And one critique, important critique, that was made to the project, the Straussian project by Fred Lee, was that, well, it doesn't really have a theory of agency. So there is no theory of agency. You just have these economic structures, but you don't have the agent. And what I will argue is that perhaps I thought a lot about this. I have, of course, a lot of respect and admiration for the work of Fred Lee. I even in the paper discuss it and discuss how we can compare his work to this project of the reconstruction of economic theory. And I was thinking a lot, how can we reply to this? Is this really a shortcoming? Why is the reason that we never have too much of that in the Straussian project and in the reconstruction of economic theory? And the reason, I think, is that sometimes we are looking for a theory of agency where we start from the motivation of the economic agent, and then we move from that motivation to explain practices. And perhaps the more adequate way to approach the problem is to take the practice as being primary, not something you explain through agency. So you don't have a theory of human agency. You have human practices as the basis for the explanation of the process of social reproduction. I think we never have Strauss saying that explicitly, but it does appear in Wittgenstein, the idea of form of life. And given that the idea of form of life or mode of life is present in Marx and in Gramsci too, and several authors, Amartya Sen, John Davis, have discussed the influence that Sraffa may have brought to Wittgenstein from Gramsci, I think it's not implausible to think that the notion of form of life is one of these notions that may have passed from Gramsci to Wittgenstein through the intermediation of Sraffa. So that leads us to a conception where we have practices as what gives meaning to our very understanding of the process of social reproduction, which is itself actualized and taking place through these practices. So what have I argued then? What am I concluding out of all of this? Essentially, the ideas I would like well, I have several ideas in the paper, but ones I've selected for this presentation, which, as I said, is much more modest than the paper itself, and perhaps the paper itself should have been a bit more modest too. But one idea is that the reason why the Cambridge controversies didn't have as much impact as they could have had is because there was an excessive emphasis on technical aspects rather than on the deeper methodological aspects. I think Joan Robinson shows that she is very aware of that when she starts to emphasize these other aspects, when she refers to Veblen. And I do think that interpretation of mainstream economics as mathematical deductivist methods or a critical commitment to that help us understand why the critique, by focusing only on technical aspects in order to engage in this kind of internal critique that Sraffa was focusing on, ended up being unable to question the deeper methodological aspect. There was perhaps not enough awareness that the essence of mainstream economics was not necessarily the production function, the utility function, but was this overall methodology. And so if you want to focus on specific analytical frameworks, you can criticize them as much as you can, but you are never abandoning the essence of what mainstream economics is. This is one of the things I wanted to say. And the second thing, which is connected to the second stage of the Cambridge Social Ontology project, is that once you realize that normativity is the basis out of which you are going to explain the economy and society, it's not something that you can explain as the interaction of human agents, but it's something that is at the very basis of social activity and even of our attribution of meaning to social activity and to understanding language, as Wittgenstein would say. Once you see that normativity is at the basis, as it seems to be the natural consequence of the critique, of the Cambridge critique, when Joan Robinson and Sraffa pointed out that distribution was an exogenous thing. And if you go back to Veblen is very clear that it's all about habits of thought, institutions that determine what distribution will be. Then you see that normativity must be seen as a basis for explaining the overall reproduction of social activity as an interconnected totality. And social positioning theory is, of course, one way to approach normativity. That's the route I followed in the paper, but of course it's not necessary that you follow necessarily this route. You can have other approaches to normativity. You have John Searle's theory, for example, social ontology. You have other kinds of theory. I think the most important part at this stage is to move to a point where you understand that social reality is constituted normatively through rights and obligations, and you move to a kind of construction or reconstruction of economic theory where normativity and rights and obligations are at the basis as a structure of social reality. Then which kind of specific approach you use? Is it the Cambridge Social Ontology? Is it other approaches to normativity? That's a different question. Of course, that's the approach I use in the paper, but I think there is a separate case to be made for bringing in normativity as a basis of social activity, independently of what is the kind of theory that you want to bring in. And what I try to do in the paper then is to understand capitalism as a process of accumulation of capital. And I characterize capital as money in terms of the results in social positioning theory that appears on money. I try to characterize capital as capital goods in terms of technology, understanding technology in terms of the expansion of as whatever human artifact, which when positioned leads to the expansion of human capabilities. But this is pretty much a work in progress. So it's a project where we keep changing our minds in discussions in Cambridge Social Ontology Group. I will perhaps at this stage leave it at here with these main conclusions on what is the contribution that Cambridge Social Ontology could potentially give to the project of the reconstruction of economic theory, which I think is an important project. I think it was neglected. I've tried to identify some reasons why it was neglected. And I also tried to give some indication of fruitful routes to proceed, which need not be necessarily the one I have adopted in the paper, but I believe it has to be, it will be fruitful if it could be developed along lines that bring normativity to center stage. So I'll leave it here, and so that we can have some time for questions as well. Thank you.